Welcome to the second section of this course, where we actually start doing things. So we actually create our project and we move on to adding a little bit of art. So this section is going to be all about adding art to our project. So when we get coding, we have something to look at. I think that's very important to have a visual outcome of what we're going to be doing as fast as possible. So let's go ahead. We have the Unity hub open over here. I also have the Unity version I've installed directly a couple of minutes ago. What we're going to do is we are going to go under projects and create a new project with the latest version we just installed. So in my case, that's 2019.4.2, which is LTS right now. So I'm going to go ahead and it asks you a couple of different things here. Do you want to create a project with the template 2D, 3D, 3D with extra, HDRP, or the universal render pipeline? Now, this one over here is the one we'll be using, the universal render pipeline. It used to be called lightweight render pipeline. And they've changed the name of it because it had a negative connotation to it, as in it has less powerful graphic than the HDRP, which is actually true, but here's the big difference. If we're going for HDRP, we would be creating a game that is more photorealistic. So something maybe amongst the line of the new Call of Duties or games where you think this is the real life and everything looks very good. The lighting is close to perfect, close to similar as a real life. But that's not what we're going for. We're going for UWRP, so Universal Render Pipeline. I don't think there's a W there. URP, right. We're going for Universal Render Pipeline because we're going for something a little bit more cartoony, a little bit more Nintendo, you could say. So Nintendo games, they usually don't go with high definition. They'd rather have more of a custom look, custom cartoony, hand painted stuff like that. And it's also more lightweight, so it's going to give more performances for our mobile device. So that being said, I've chosen this template. I'm going to give this the name the 2020 Runner tutorial. Of course, you can call it something different on your end. I like having no space in between. What you could do is add underscore if that bothers you, or dashes. But sometime when you're doing some operation in those folders, having spaces in between is going to make things complicated if you're approaching this through the command line, for example. So I'm going to go ahead and create this project. I'll actually put it on the desktop. And here we go. All right, so once everything is completed, the project is created, you will end up seeing all of this. So there's a couple of things in there. It's basically the universal render pipeline template. So they want to show you exactly what this thing can do. And if you wish, you could press on start and move around with your mouse and see how the lighting behave. I believe you can also change the directional light. Have a couple of things and just play around with this template. I actually don't like having stuff in there, and I don't like this layout. If it's your first time using Unity, then I recommend that you use my layout, the exact same one I'm about to show you. And if it's not your first time, of course, you are used to something different, go ahead and use that, whatever feels the best for you. Now, as I've mentioned, if it is your first time, I invite you to go towards the right-hand side of the engine over here at the top and click on Default. And I'll be going with a tall layout just like so. Now, I like the tall layout for one reason, and it's the fact that I can have both my hierarchy and my project in the same row like this. And when it comes down to the project itself, I like right-clicking on it and having the one column layout so it looks more like a Windows Explorer down here. Now, one more thing I'd like to do is I'd like you to pull the game window and actually anchor it on the left-hand side like so. So you click, hold, and you drag wherever you want. So as we create our game over here in the scene window, we can have an immediate preview of what goes on the mobile version. Okay, and one more thing I'd like to do is clean up this project before we move any further. So if you could please go ahead, maybe delete all the example assets from the project, delete the material, delete the presets. The scene folder, I'll keep it, but I'll actually delete the scene. Script, I'll delete the script, but keep the folder. Now there's a bunch of profiles right here. I invite you to delete all of these. Tutorial info, and also the README. So there's nothing left except three folders actually. And we have a scene over here with stuff in it. I do recommend that you hit Control N, which is going to create a new scene. If we go here, you can also do it from the menu. And here we go. We have a clean project. You know what? Let's go ahead and save this scene. So hit Control S, or if you prefer, save, and create a scene that is called game. I will grab this one and put it in the scene folder. From this point on, we should now be able to create our game using a very, very fresh project. The only real thing we kept from the render pipeline template is if we go under to Window, and do note that you'll have to do this if you're starting from an existing project, go to Window, Package Manager, and install the universal render pipeline over here from the Package Manager. If you don't see it, make sure that you toggle all packages and you give it a little bit of time to load. Then you can find it in here in a bunch of packages available to you. But in my project right now, we have the universal render pipeline. Before we move on to importing assets, 3D assets, and actually seeing them in action using the universal render pipeline, we have to create a couple of settings because we've deleted those a couple of seconds ago. So I invite you to right-click on Settings, go over to Create, and then we can find, I believe it's Rendering, Universal Render Pipeline, and a Pipeline Asset. We can call this one the Universal Render Pipeline Asset, just like so. Now you'll see two new assets showing up in your settings. To make sure that our project actually uses these, we have to go under Edit, Project Settings, under Graphics, and we're going to drag and drop our pipeline asset. And now the project is actually using the universal render pipeline asset to render everything. This now means that the whole rendering of our project is actually being handled by this asset over here, and it has a couple of settings on the right-hand side. So every time you do a modification to these settings, you'll be able to see some actual change. So if we go over here and we decide that the quality, the render scale is different, you see over here in my render that things are different. If I decide that my render scale is 10% of what it's supposed to be, then in this case, I'll get a more blurry look for the whole project. And the lighting is also being installed here, shadows, and so on. We will definitely come back to these when we have more assets, because right now it's very difficult to decide what type of shadow you'll be using, what type of settings you'll be using in general, because we don't have an actual scene, we don't have assets to look at. I've just put a cube in there, but that's never enough to give a general feel to the game. So we'll definitely come back to this, but make sure that it is there, it's being set to use the universal render pipeline asset, because we'll need that in the next video. Now, included in the resources for this video, you will find a link to the documentation regarding the universal render pipeline. And you'll have more information on it regarding, for example, the features. So if you'd like to know what is the difference in between this and the built-in render pipeline, so everything beneath what we have, so you'll find out things such as the color texture is on, you have static batching, and more information. Do note that some of these are being developed. So for example, in research over here, in research, you have a couple of things that changes. Now, the big reason we're using the this pipeline and not the built-in one is because this one is going to persist in the future. It gives us the scriptable rendering pipeline, which is also very cool. It means that you will have control at a very low level of how you want to render your game. And that makes it a lot better if you're trying to do effects such as toon shading, or if you're trying to curve the whole world. It gives you a place where you can do that on a much lower level, so it's much less expensive. And that is pretty much it. So any other question, please leave it in the course comments down below. And I'll see you in the next video where we'll start importing a couple of assets. In this video, we will go ahead and include a couple of 3D assets that were already made for this course. Since we're not doing a 3D course, since we're not showing you how to use Blender or 3ds Max, we already have some assets ready because we want to have a direct impact on your game. So as soon as we start coding, we'd like to see visually what goes on with decent assets. So this is why they are being provided, and I'll show you exactly how to get them today for free. If you have more question regarding how you can use these assets, maybe in the commercial sense, you can go over to our website and click on the license button over here. Basically, it says that everything is free to use commercially and so on. We do appreciate that if you do it commercially, however, to leave a link or at least mention the website. Okay, but it's not needed. So let's go ahead and head over to the website. So epidemy.cc or epidemy.games, both of them is going to work. Head over to the download section, and the package name is going to be called 2020 Subway Skater Course. If you prefer, you can just type in 2020 in the search. It's the first one here. You can hit download, and it's going to give you a package file. Now, package file are great because I have Unity open right here from the previous video, and I can just double click on the package file I've just downloaded, so this one, and automatically it's going to give me all of these assets, and it's going to give me a prompt that I can just click on import, and everything should be in my project already as soon as this is completed, of course. And here we go. So we have a couple more things. We have an artwork folder that includes some PSD files. So for Photoshop, you can modify this if you wish. The assets might be different in your case because chances are I've repolished them before you're seeing this course. Right now, I have an early version of this, but by the time that you download this and you watch, most likely you're going to see the same exact thing, but with better art and better icons because sometimes I struggle at making art, so I need some help. Okay, next up, we have three different material. You'll see that two of them are actually not showing, so they're pink, and we'll fix that when we start making shaders. And then we have models, bunch of models for the environment, for example, a bear, firewood, glacier, igloo, bunch of nice 3D models. And I'm just going to drop them in here, of course, delete all of that in a moment. We have a gameplay asset. So these are really measured and created for gameplay. For example, this is something you can get on. And if you have another one over here, for example, a rock you can jump over. And we have letters, just in case you want to spell something out in 3D, just like the title. The splash screen of this game is going to be made with these letters. And finally, the penguin. Now, the penguin is going to be the main character, which is why it has its own folder, and also it has a animator, which is already made, but we'll go over and we'll recreate all of that together. So here it is. That's the main character of our game. Now you're going to realize that all of these, for example, the penguin, it doesn't have any color on it. And that's because it's using a material that doesn't have any color on it. So it's very important that we go ahead and we actually fix our materials. So going back under the material folder, the one that pretty much every single asset use, actually all the assets from the folder, it uses either the atlas, and for the letter, it uses the letters. But this is the one that that is used by everybody. So the one called Atlas. And if you want to, we can go over to why and how this was done in the future video. It's going to be an optional video. But right now, I want you to go ahead and drag and drop this on top of the penguin. And you'll see that we have some issues. Those issues, so the pink here, is actually due because the shader over here is not found. So if I head over to the top over here, it says hidden internal error shader, which is not what we want, obviously. In the future, we will want a shader that does a lot of things. So it renders the color and it's going to bend the world. But right now, we don't have that logic in there. So what we can do is just do some simple rendering of a texture. So if we head over to Universal Render Pipeline and we choose, for example, lit, then we'll go back to having at least a color. But this time, let's go and include a base map in there. You'll find out that's all the buttons we've included, all the new icons we've included. The one we're really interested in is the Atlas texture. And you're going to see now that the penguin does have its color, its actual proper color, coming out of this small texture over here. So if I double click on it, I just want to open it so you can see what it's being sampled from. It's this small texture over here. So the penguin is actually being drawn using these. It's a 64 by 64, and it does everything we need. So our whole game, all the assets included in that folder, are all actually pulling from this. Now, to give you another example, I'll go ahead and I'll drag a normal block. That's one for the gameplay. And it's right there. I'll go ahead and I'll drag and drop the Atlas material on it, and you'll see that it now takes its color. It all uses the same exact texture, the same exact material, which is the Atlas material. The technique of using a single material for everything in an atlas is something very, very old. It's something that a lot of people probably did in the past, using a very, very small texture, 64 by 64. It's a technique that is old, but still very, very efficient today. And it makes sure that we don't run into too much problem when it comes down to the performances, because we're only using one material, which means we have batching happening on pretty much anything that isn't affected by the light. And also the texture in memory doesn't take a lot of space. So it's a very, very efficient way to do things. Now, if you are curious on how we went and we did that, how we created those assets to do this, please go ahead and watch the optional video at the bottom of this section. If you're not interested, it is not a problem. Just move on to the next video in which we start adding animations to this penguin. We are now going to have a look at animations in Unity. So as mentioned prior, we are quickly going to go over art related stuff so we can jump into the code and have things moving. Now, looking at animations, we do have some of them under the model penguin, and under these are the animation. They are actually just like a mesh. So for example, this is a penguin and it has no animation in it. It does have a penguin avatar, it does have a rig, but it has no motion. And by motion, I mean, for example, if we open up the run, you'll find this over here. This is emotion. This is how it is being represented. And it's really important to actually know that this is animation imported from another software. If you'd like to create an animation from Unity, you can always right click anywhere, create animation. Now, if you're curious on how it looks, the animation window is just like a keyframe tool that you would be using, for example, in video editing. If you double click on the animation you either created or one of them that you imported, you'll be able to see them inside of the animation window. Now this one is a empty animation we just created, so let me quickly delete. And let's have a look at the jump. And as you can see, it is quite confusing at first. If you look on the left side, this is how the bones will react to the animation. So you'll see that the hips are going to move in X, Y, and Z. And it is quite a bunch of information. It's really, really hard to read. Especially something that comes from another software. If you haven't made this one by hand, it's going to be fairly hard to read. And you can also view as curves. So this is how our jump looks like. All of these values are bound to a certain axis and also bound to a certain bone. So for example, we modify the rotation of the left leg, and this is how it looks like. That's just the left leg during a certain time of the jump. And the jump is roughly 1.5 seconds long. So one thing that is important to look at is the import settings. So when you click on one of these, if it's something that you imported from somewhere else, in this example, we imported it from a tool called Mixamo. And there's an optional video on that if you'd like. It's a very cool tool that gives you free animation. It is very important you have a look at the import settings because it includes a couple of things you'd like to have. Let's start over here with the model. Now, something that is quite cool is that if you have a look at the penguin itself, you see him. You see that he has a mesh, you see a visual. If I take the jump and I drag and drop him right here, you'll see that we do have an object. There's a rig. Inside of the rig, there's a spine and, a neck, a head. All of these, they do exist. However, there is no mesh attached to it. And that is a fairly cool optimization technique where you don't import the mesh every time you import an animation. Instead, you just import the bone structure and you make the bone move with a mesh that already exists. So in this case, this penguin over here, he doesn't need anything. He just needs to have the rig, and you are going to take the bone values and play it inside of this mesh. And so when we see over here on the left-hand side, the model, it's actually not being imported at all. So I believe we could change anything here and it wouldn't do anything because we did not import the model. However, if we change it in Penguin, as you can see, it's going to change things. So if I decide that my scale factor is 50, then it's going to be reduced by half its size. I'm going to put it back on 100. Now, one other part we're interested here is the rig itself. So on our base mesh, on the penguin, the one that contains the model, it's fairly important that we decide what type of rig this is. Now, moving on to the rig section. Under here, you'll find that there's a couple of different animation type. The two that are quite interesting, especially for mobile game, is the generic one and also the legacy one. Why exactly do I like the legacy one? Well, it is because the old system, the legacy system of Unity, is quite optimal for certain things. If you had an object that had only one animation clip, it doesn't have multiple state, it's just a simple animation that plays in a loop or it just plays once, you would opt for the legacy. In terms of performances, it's much easier for Unity, it's much faster for Unity to run this under a legacy. Now, if you're going to run something a little bit more complex, just like this penguin, he can run, he can be on idle, he can jump, then you want to go under generic and use the mechanism animation system. But today, since we're making something that uses multiple animation and blending in between these animation, we're going to be looking at using the generic version. And then finally, the one we're interested in the most is the animation tab. And you'll see here, there's nothing in here. And that's because we're looking at Penguin. Penguin itself is just the model and the rig. It's not the animation. The animation are all split in different clips. So if I click, for example, under jump, I will find the animation. I'll find the import animation window. I'll find a couple of more values here. I'll find the clips. So you can have multiple clips if you wish. For example, there is a optimization technique where you render only one animation, but you chain them. And if I am to describe this a little bit better, is you would have a animation clip inside of Maya where your character would run for like 30 frames, and then it would walk for another 30, it would jump right after, and it would fall, all in one clip. And then you would come here in Unity and say, hey, you know what? The walking is the first 30 seconds, 30 frames, and then from 30 to 60, that's the falling, and so on. So you would decide it over here, and then you would say, hey, that's the part where we're walking. Hey, that's the part where we're running, and so on. So you would modify these. But in our case, we separate all the animation under their own 3D object. So we are going to go ahead and make sure this is the full value. Now, something else very important is this button over here called loop time, and it's a Boolean. This is actually to make sure your animation is going to loop. And sometimes that's wanted, but sometimes that is not wanted. Now, I'll give you an example. For this penguin to run, and I'll actually go ahead and drag and drop the animator on top of the penguin, just to make sure we have some animation in there. And now you will see him moving. And as you can tell, we have an animation right here. That's the idle animation that repeats itself. And that is extremely important because if it wouldn't, then, after the animation, it would just stop there and look quite weird. However, there is some other animation. For example, I'm just going to pop this one out. The death animation. So if I am to trigger death, the penguin falls and he dies. But then if that would loop, it would give a very, very odd result. For example, I'm going to toggle the loop time, make sure he dies, and imagine this would loop. So you're dead, and then this would play on over and over again. So in this case, looping the animation is definitely not something we want. So I'll make sure to toggle this one off. Okay, so we did a brief overview on the animation in Unity and also the import setting. We will come back and look at the animator window, so what I've just shown right here. We just had a brief look at animations in Unity. To make everything work together, however, we need some type of controller. We need somebody that say, hey, you should play this animation now, and if something happens, you play this animation now, and sometimes even blend two animations together. So as we go from walking to running, blend the two together so it looks good, it looks nice, and it doesn't just snap. And this thing is actually called the animator. Um, it's this item right here that is part of the Penguin folder. But you know what? Today we are going to create a animator from scratch. We do have one right here in reference just in case, but we are going to create one from scratch. Now I invite you to actually, if you don't have the animator on top of your Penguin, go ahead and either drag and drop the animator clip, or you can go ahead and add component animator. Now, if you import assets from somewhere else, so if you import assets, for example, from 3ds Max, you might see this thing already on there. And you might be thinking, hey, this object maybe could be animated. Maybe this is a big overhead. Maybe this is costly. The truth in the matter is that nothing happens if you don't have a controller. So if this is set to none, this object just like doesn't exist whatsoever. So technically you wouldn't have to remove it to save performances. When the project is built, this is not going to be assumed. Now, in our case, we wanted to create one today. So we wanted to create an actual controller. To do so, we can right click, create. Oh, by the way, yeah, right click in your project folder, create the animator controller. And I'm going to call this one Penguin Animator 2.0. Just note that by the end of the video, I'm going to wipe this one completely and we'll use the previous one, the one that is part of the package. But I wanted to go through the window, and the best way to do so is to actually do it. So start from scratch. Now, if you'd like to open up the animator window, what you can do is simply double click on it. So double click on your animator or go over to Window, Animation, Animator. I'm going to anchor this one outside of the Unity box. This is a empty animator window. It always contains three items by default. First, the entry. So when you press on play, a exit if you wish for your animation state machine to end at one point. So if your player dies and it has no way of reviving whatsoever, and also the any state, which is fairly useful, and we'll see what it does in a second. Now, if you want to add stuff in there, you have to right click and either create a substate machine or a state. We are going to be using state. And now, as of right now, our animation window does not play anything. Our state is in entry, and it might as well just go from entry to exit. Like it doesn't do anything. So to make sure that we actually go inside of a state, we're going to right click, create a empty state, and let's call this one. You can modify it by clicking here in the inspector. We'll call this one idle. So now technically we go from entry to idle, but really nothing is in there as of the moment. One thing I'd like to show you is that we can actually get live feed from the game with the auto live link button activated at the top here. But for that to happen, we need to have an object that uses our animator. So let's go back on the Penguin, and then under the control over here, let's grab the Penguin Animator 2.0. While I have this one selected, I'm going to play the game. So right now I don't see anything. I'm going to select the penguin, and then you'll see that idle is actually being played. If I unselect my penguin, it's still going to maintain this one, but if I was to double click on the base object, so the root object, it's not bound to anything. If you want to see the object in action and where it is in the flow, you really have to select that object in the inspector, and that is the live link. So right now we are stuck in a idle position, but this is just the state. It's not actually the motion. It's not actually the animation clip. So what we can do is now head over at the top right and say, hey, this is actually the idle animation. And you'll see that the player just snapped completely. Now he is playing this short little animation. So that's really cool. Now we're stuck here and we're not going anywhere. If we were to stop this, you're going to realize that these settings from the animator are actually being saved at runtime as well. So I don't have to stop the engine. I don't have to modify it after. It's actually being saved as I modify it. So that's a fairly cool feature. Now looking at our inspector, we don't have any transition away from this. So that could be something cool. So if we want to move away from just being idle all the time, we should create another state. So I'm going to go ahead and create the running state. And the way we create a transition in between the two is by right-clicking on the source, make transition, and click on the destination. And just like this, we should go from one to the other. So idle is being played, and once it's completed, we go into running. And then running is just nothing, as you could see here. It just went back to default pause. So let's make sure we go under running and give him that sweet little run animation. And here we go. So we're stuck in there. Now, obviously, we would not really want that to happen in the game because we want to be the one to define, hey, you should start running now. When I press on play, you should start running. But if I decide to stay in the lobby or in the beginning screen for like 5 minutes, then we should be on idle for the 5 minutes. The way we go ahead and we tackle this is by clicking on this arrow in between. Now, this gives us all these settings on the right-hand side, but the one we're really interested in here is conditions. So we need a condition to start running. We want to add something, but you're going to realize that if we click on the plus sign for transition, or sorry, condition, parameter does not exist. So we now have to introduce a new concept to this whole thing, and it's the one for parameters right here on the left-hand side. So I will be clicking on parameters, and unfortunately, we cannot add any of these during play mode. So I'll turn it off, and I'll create a new float, int, bool, or trigger. For starter, I'll create a new one called running or run. To begin, we're going to start by creating ourselves a float parameter. Its information will be sending to the state machine every now and then. This one is going to be called speed. So what we could do now with this number we have here is say, hey, if our speed is above 1, let's go ahead and start running. And that's exactly what I'll do. So now we have a parameter. I can go back here, click on condition, and say, is speed greater than, for example, 1? Yes. Okay, then we go ahead and we start running. One cool thing when you're playing this with the auto live link is that we can actually modify these without having to trigger it through code just yet. So if we're just testing around and we say, hey, set the speed of this player to like 5 or 10, then we're going to do it right here. And you're going to see the character running from that point on. Now, one thing that is very subtle that we have to look at is right here. So you see the animation is playing. I turn it to 10. And we're still not running because the animation has to complete first before we're being pushed into running. And that's not the behavior we want because as soon as we start, as the game starts, as we set a speed to our player, we would like to start running immediately. And this is where the Boolean over here called has exit time actually comes in. So I'm going to disable this one, press play. And now the second that I turn this to 10, it's going to start running right away. And just like this, we are going to be able to make this move with our code. Okay. Next thing we have to introduce is the any state. So with any state, it's basically you can have a condition just like this one called at any moment or being verified every single frame. So for example, if we decide to jump, so I'll create myself a new state, call it jump, and create a link in between these two. So I make a transition in between any state and jump. It is important when you go from any state to have at least one condition. So here, I don't really have any condition. I only have speed for parameters. So I'll create a new trigger, call it jump. And now with this new trigger, I'll put a condition between the two and I'll say, hey, if the trigger jump exists, then go and switch to the jump animation. And also I'll make sure to set the motion to jump. What this means is that, um, you know, wherever you are at any moment, we are always going to be looking to go into jump. So this condition right here, the jump condition, is always being tested. So even if we're running right now, or even if we're idle, it has no connection with jump. But if I press on the jump trigger, it's going to jump. Now, unfortunately, after that, nothing happens simply because we're stuck there. The only other thing that could happen, the only exit we could have, is another jump because we're still looking for this one. We're always looking for a transition outside of any state. So if I trigger this again, jump is being played again. Now, with all of that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and create the rest of this fairly quickly. We have the def state, which use the def animation. We also have the sliding. And finally, we have the respawn, which actually uses the jump motion. So all of these are here. There is a condition in between all of them at every single moment. And these parameters are the following. So we have the slide, we have running, respawn, def. Oh, and there's also another one I use. It's Boolean. It's for knowing whether if the player is on the ground. So it's called is grounded. Oh, and one more trigger that is called fall. So the condition for dying is def. The condition for sliding is slide. Condition for respawn is, of course, respawn. And then if we look at the other state machine, I do have flow coming out of respawn, not def. Jump is a yes, and also slide is a yes. The condition in between these is when we trigger running, then we go back to running from slide. If we trigger is grounded from the jump, then we go back to running, and respawn, if is grounded through, we go back to running. So with that in mind, we can recreate this like so. So slide here was set on running, and respawn was set on grounded, and jump was also set on grounded. So I've just recreated the same state machine we're using with the original. The only difference, I believe, right now, the only difference is the has exit time. I want to toggle this off for every single one of them. Now, the only difference in between the one we've created and the one that already exists is the speed at which we blend in between animation. And let me give you an example here. There's additional settings that we haven't played around with too much here, but if I go from any state to jumping, you'll see that if you look very, very carefully, you'll see that it takes a little bit of time before we get up and then we jump. This is actually being controlled on the right-hand side over here, and I could make that instant if I just took this and I put it all the way over here. And then if I go to a jump, it's 100% going to jump immediately, like in the full jump pulse. However, if we drag this out and we just put, say, the end of the jump clip, we can end up with a result that is much different, where we basically almost don't see the legs lifting off it. We have a weird behavior here. So this is the only difference in between the two. It takes a little bit of tweaking. As you can see, we can move that a little bit on this side, maybe it look better. Yeah, it feels a little bit better. Still not fast enough. But this is the only difference in between the two. And that is why I wanted to make sure that I use the one that I spent a little bit of time on to make it look decent. So what I'll do to wrap up this video is I'll go ahead, go on my penguin, remove the animator I currently have and put the old one in there. And we will now be able to go from here using these animation. Okay, so that being done, we'll have some animation with the penguin for us to use in the near future. Now, the next step we should tackle is maybe create a small environment and play around with the settings and the shaders. So I'll see you fairly shortly. In this next step, we're going to go over something that is not necessarily required, but it's something I highly encourage you to do, and it's to create a small, very small environment in which we can preview our models. Because in a very near future, we will be playing around with the shadow settings and with the lightweight rendering pipeline settings or the universal render pipeline settings. So in order to view those changes properly, I'd like us to go ahead and just lay down a piece of environment, which we could also use for our starter screen. So I'm going to go ahead and just base everything around the center of the world, that is 0, 0, 0. And I'll create myself a 3D object that is a plane, and that's going to be my floor. And I'm going to go ahead and just make sure I anchor this back at the center of the world. Here it is. And I'll start laying down some of the objects that we have in our model folder, especially in the environment, because they're not going to be used for anything else really, but just the looks. Maybe drop a cabin in here. This one is quite big, so I reduce the size to say half of it. So 0.5 on all axes. And you don't have to snap this anywhere. You don't have to make sure it's pixel perfect. This is really just for looks. So I'm going to go ahead and just maybe turn this around a little bit. Which angle should I be facing? So knowing that our character is going to be running in the z-axis forward, so in this direction, I'll want this to be angling like so. So in this angle, it's pretty good because then what we can do is when we start a game, we can have a look at our penguin like right here. And then when we hit play, we start running in that direction. So it's like a small transition that might happen with the camera. What else could we do? We could use, we could swap up the light just a little bit so we can see better. We could use fishing ground. So I invite you to play around with this and create a very small environment around the player so we can actually play with the settings, the render pipeline settings just afterward. Now, if your material don't work just like me, make sure you go ahead and drag and drop this on top of every single one of it. So this is the Atlas texture. It's actually the one included inside of the environment folder, and this is the one that should be applied to everything. So as you can see here, I just modified this one, and you can see that the result is being pushed over to every single object that has these. So now it looks a little bit better. Now, one thing I'll do before I close this one off is that I'll go over to my material, and there is a snow material that I'll just put on top of my floor. Now, of course, this shader is not ready for this, so let me go ahead and fix it. Universal render pipeline. We're going to be using a lit, and we'll be using the snow texture. So something very simple like this. It's not perfect. The snow doesn't look too great at the moment, but we can look into fixing this once we go ahead and apply the real changes. So at this point, we should have enough model on the screen to start tweaking with the rendering settings and have a better result. Because right now we're looking at this and it's really hard to tell. You can see that the shadow is here, but it's all jaggy. The texture are all jaggy as well. We need to address this, and that's exactly what we'll be doing in the next video. We now have an environment that contains a little bit of asset. It contains a couple of things we can have a good look at while we tweak our URP render settings. And that's exactly what we'll do right now. So headed over to my settings folder, I do have the asset over here called the Universal Render Pipeline asset. And if we click on it, we'll see a huge drop down on the right-hand side. It contains pretty much everything we're going to be tweaking around with today, starting with General. The general contain a render list, which I am not going to get into this video. However, there is an optional video that will explain different type of renderer you can use, and you can stack them on top of each other. That is the power of the scriptable rendering pipeline, but it's not something we'll get into this because it's a little bit of an advanced topic. Going under quality, the rest are, wait, let me go over these again. So the depth texture, if you plan on using depth texture for any reason really in the future, if you have a shader that uses a depth, it needs to know how far away an object is from camera. You have to enable this so your camera produces one depth texture. Same thing for opaque texture. This pretty much act as a grab pass. It's pretty much the exact thing as if you were doing a grab pass. So those don't actually, if you're not familiar with shaders, those leave them off since you're not using them. It's something really that if you make shaders, you want to maybe grab information from what you're rendering, and this is a way to do it. So this is basically just save a texture in memory every single time we render something. And it can be used to produce nice effects such as frosted glass or reflections and that kind of stuff. Now for Terran alls, I actually don't know what this is, but if we hover this, the URP will remove all Terran Hall shader variant when you build this for Inti Player. This decreases build time. You know what? It decreases build time. I'm going to remove it since I don't use Terran anyway. Headed down in quality, we have the high definition range here, or the high definition range. Yeah, that has to be it. The lighting, which is actually going to push your brightness a little bit higher than it should. So I don't want to use this. If you were to create really high photorealistic scenes, then you probably want to use this. But in our case here, it's a very simple game. And we're not going to be super photorealistic. We're not going to take it outside of the usual color range. So it's not something we need to enable. And by not enabling it, we save quite a bit of memory. Next up, we have the anti-aliasing. Let's have a look at anti-aliasing. So if I zoom in, oh, I have to zoom in with the camera. If we go very, very close to an edge like this, and we have a look on the game scene, and I zoom in a bit, you'll see this jagged line over here. What anti-aliasing does is actually it takes this line and it blurs it out a little bit. So if you have a look here, we go from disabled to X2, X4, and X8. So it makes it a little bit smoother. And believe it or not, it is quite inexpensive operation. It's definitely not something that we'll see on our mobile device. So as you can tell here, I'm very, very, very zoomed in on this object and will never encounter this kind of zoom during our game. And I can barely see the difference in between the highest setting and the lowest. So that's a no for us. I'll move back my camera now. Next up, what we have is I believe it was the render scale. If you'd like to downscale your game, you can do it here. It's the equivalent of saying if you render your game 100 pixel by 100 pixel, well, let's do it 10 by 10 instead. Or you can put it on 2. So say if you're rendering 100 by 100, but that would make it 200 by 200. So it's a good way to upscale or downscale your game. Next up, we have the lighting tab, and this one is the most important one to understand. If you're moving over from the old version of Unity, the old version of lighting, the old version of rendering, I could say, this is where you'll want to focus and make sure you fully understand this. I'm just going to quickly disable the additional light because that's fairly important. Main light is your main light. It's actually defined as the brightest directional light in the scene, I believe. Yeah, if you hover this, it says main light is the brightest directional light. And if additional light is disabled, you realize that, hey, I have this directional light here. I can play around with it. If I duplicate one and I move it around, it doesn't have any effect whatsoever. And that's because that's not the main light. The main light is right here. And if I move this one, will not matter. So if you find yourself lost because one of your light doesn't work, that's most likely the case because one of them is acting as the main light and there is no additional light involved. Now, if you'd like to have two different lights, two different directional light, you would have to enable this part down here, additional lights. Now I can actually play with two different directional light if I wish so. It is, however, not the case, so I went ahead and I deleted it. Next up in the settings, we have cast shadow, which is quite self-explanatory. Would you like your light to cast shadow? Yep or no? It's actually something we might want to go for. No shadow for mobile game is first very optimal because you don't have to run shadows, and shadows is a expensive operation, and it looks good. So if you have end painted texture, sometimes you decide to paint the shadow within the texture, and it makes it looks like it has shadow even though it doesn't. That can be very, very cool. That can be very beneficial. So as you can see, we can play around with the lighting, and we don't have shadow, but there is still shadowy part to your object. So it might actually be a good idea to run without shadows, and it's something that is completely up to you. But do note that if you don't enable it, well, you save a lot of memory. But in case you want to enable it, I'm going to go ahead and start tweaking with the settings a bit. So shutter resolution, you can play around with it. You'll see exactly what it is. The highest definition the more fidelity your shadow is going to have with the object it's being cast off. And the lower, well, it's going to look like this. Now, shadow, as I've just mentioned, is a very expensive operation. And if you're to run it on mobile devices, I would not recommend going above, well, I want to say 512. Uh, but yeah, 256, 512. In my case, if I am to run shadow, I run it at 512 at the maximum. And that's for high-end devices. If not, 256 is just fine. Next up, we have the additional lights. Now, we could disable it altogether if we don't plan on using any more lights. And that could be the case. It's really up to you. But for example, if I'd like to just have something lit up within my, like in the small house over here, like a point light, well, obviously nothing happens because the whole rendering only knows that there is a directional light, nothing else. And this one could be used for baked light, but really we're not baking any light in this case. So I'd have to toggle this on. And then from this point on, I now have access to a small light within my house here. And it's the exact same thing as above. So you have access to cast shadow, shadow resolution is here, and you play around with these settings. For the sake of this tutorial, I'll actually disable it. I don't actually want to have additional light in this case. I'll just keep one for my whole game, I believe, and it's going to be a little bit more optimal. And maybe in the future, if it looks better, I'll go ahead and I'll disable the shadows as well. But for the moment, we're going to go ahead and keep them on because the next section has all to do with shadows. Now remember, those shadows are 512, so the texture is actually 512, but it looks quite jagged. What you can do is you can simply ask for having soft shadow, which make it look a little bit better for a mobile game. And I actually like that quite a lot. But in this case, I will go ahead and I will keep the shadows because we'll need them for this next section, which is actually called shadows. And we're going to start with the first setting over here called distance. Now, distance has to do with which distance do you actually see these shadows. So if we are to quickly just reduce this over time, and you know what, just to make this a little bit more clear, I'll make the shadow very, very good quality. And I'll go ahead and I'll move down the distance. And you're going to see that with a low distance, as I zoom in, you can now start seeing the shadow pop up slowly. And our game is it goes quite far, like in terms of distance. So we want to keep that to a certain number, maybe even 70 or 75 or 100 might be good enough, actually. But if you feel like we don't need to render that far away, um, what you can do is actually create level of details. So you could say, hey, yeah, we're going to take a 100, but the shadows that are a little bit further away from me, let's render them with less quality. And the one that are very far in the back, again, let's render them with less quality. Now I'll go with a distance that is roughly 50 for a game because we go quite far in the z-axis. We go quite far, so we might want to have shadows in the far distance. Now feel free to play around with these cascade settings. I'm actually not going to use one, and I'm actually going to use soft shadows on top of that. And it's going to make things a little bit more expensive by using soft shadows, but at the same time, it is going to allow me to reduce this texture resolution by quite a lot because we're on 4K right now. Rendering 4K shadow is obviously way too much. It's just a matter of playing around with the settings, see what fits your game the most. But one tip I can give you is always have a look on the left-hand side. So in your game view, that's the most important. And not this scene, because this scene is not representative of what is going to be the real, what the cameras really see. Moving on, we have the post-processing settings, which we will come back to. We haven't played around with post-processing just yet, so not really useful we play around with this settings just yet. And then finally, with the advanced settings, it asks if you want to have a batcher for the scriptable rendering pipeline. Yep, dynamic batching, I would also enable that. Usually, I would enable that, but here, I'm not sure if we need it since everything should be batched already. It doesn't have to be dynamic, however. We only have one light and everything is on the same shader. So I'm going to check this, but I doubt that it's going to change anything because everything should already be batched together. And then debug level shader variant is not settings we're going to be playing around with in the scope of this course. All right, so now we've set the rendering settings. To give a better feel to our scene, what we could do next, and something that heavily affects it, is the lights. So the lighting, how everything looks. Because we have just one main light, this should be quite simple to do actually. So I'm actually going to change the light color to have a bright white, actually a pure white, just like this. And I'm not actually going to play with anything else. Maybe with the shadows a little bit. I don't want to have too much shadows. If you play with these settings, you'll see that we can have shadows that are very opaque versus having something that's a little bit less opaque. I like having something very subtle, maybe like this, so 0.75. However, it is completely up to your preferences. And if you go over to the sky folder, I actually left a skybox in there with a couple of settings over here, and it's a material that I've created. It's extremely simple to create. In fact, if you want to do it, you can always right-click, create material, and change the shader for skybox, which let me check. It's skybox and then procedural in this case, and set everything here manually. But I've made one, and you can simply drag and drop it in the sky, and it's going to look something like this. So it gives us a very bright sky, and it gives us a very bright horizon. If you do modify the angle of the sun, though, you're going to see that it shifts quite a lot. It can look very weird, but at the same time, it can give you some really nice effect at the end of the game. Maybe if you run for long enough, you could go to hell or something. I don't know. But that being said, let's save this, and we have a much better feel with this game already. We have much better colors. We have much better ambience, and that is actually where we're going to wrap up this one. And I'll see you